Okay, so for those of you joining us virtually, welcome to Columbia Cottage virtually. We are in North Portland, in Columbia Park, in Columbia Cottage, which was built in 1940. We're in a historic cottage here in Columbia Park. And we are here to have our Good Parks speaker series, and we're on number three event of our speaker series. My name is Rachel Burden. I'm the president of Friends of Columbia Park. And we, the Friends group, Friends of Columbia Park, are here to ensure that Columbia Park is Portland's cherished outdoor hub for the well-being of current and future generations through advocacy, stewardship, and programming like we're doing tonight through our Good Parks series. Again, this is the third of a series of events that's celebrating Frederick Law Olmsted. 2022, the year that we're in, marks the 200th anniversary of the birth of Frederick Law Olmsted, who was a social reformer and a founder of American landscape architecture. Friends of Columbia Park is really excited to join the National Association for Olmsted Parks and other parks enthusiasts across the country who are celebrating his legacy of landscape design and public parks like Columbia Park that we're in tonight. Again, this is a series of presentations that we're holding to hear from experts and historians around parks and good parks. We're particularly excited tonight to welcome William J. Hawkins, who again is the third in a series, and there'll be more after him, but tonight is really exciting to welcome Mr. Hawkins, who I will introduce in just a moment. One thing I'd like to do is really appreciate all of you who are coming out to celebrate with us and to hear some of our esteemed community members to talk about the parks in our community. And I would also like to thank you for your feedback. Again, we are an all-volunteer stewardship group for Columbia Park, and this is a new thing for us. We're giving this lecture series a go, and we've gotten some really good feedback about how we're doing, and we'll continue to ask you for that as we go through. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank our board members, Jeff Hale, Greg Dilks, Rebecca Small, Mary England, John Flannery, and Haley Pickus. This small but mighty group of us, all volunteer board members, keep vibrancy alive in Friends of Columbia Park, our group, and in the park. And I really want to appreciate how much work that everybody is doing to make this happen. We are working on the details to add more speakers after Mr. Hawkins to the lineup. So please check back at our website, focb.org, for updates. I am pleased to announce that for June, which will be on June 8th, we have Adina Long, Director of Portland Parks and Recreation, and Jonathan Blasher, who is the Director of Parks and Nature for Metro, our regional government, who will be part of a panel talking about parks and nature and parks and recreation in our community as leaders of color. So as part of the Olmsted 200-year celebration, also, our speaker from last month, Lawrence Cotton, will speak again at the Oregon Historical Society. So I wanted to let folks know that who saw him last month. He will be speaking again at the Oregon Historical Society on Tuesday, April 5th at 7 p.m. So check the OHS, Oregon Historical Society website if you want to join that and learn more. I also just want to acknowledge and appreciate Suzanne Bishop, who helped kick off our series with the first event. So Suzanne did an excellent job. And then kind of outside of this Good Parks series, I also want to announce that next week on Monday, March 14th, we are hosting State Representative Travis Nelson for a neighborhood discussion about North Portland Aquatic Center, and recent state funding that Representative Nelson has received to further that effort. You can register for that event on Monday, March 14th via our website, that's focp.org. Attendance in person is probably closed at this point. We're trying to limit it, but virtual attendance is unlimited. So please come and hear what Representative Nelson has to say. And again, just want to say we're really grateful and excited by the response that we've had from all of you in virtual land and here to again join us for this inaugural series. We have maybe 15 people here tonight. And how many people do we have virtually about?
55.
55 people. So welcome all of you and thanks for joining us. If you don't know about Friends of Columbia Park, just a little plug, please check out our website again, focp.org. If you're not a friend, please join, become a friend. It's free and easy. And the more we have in our membership, the stronger our voice is and the more that we can do together to steward Columbia Park. Two logistics I want to mention for people in the room, well, and people online too. We anticipate that the lecture will be about an hour. And then if you're here in the room, if you need to use the restrooms, please use the ones in the back down that hallway. And then the last thing here I would really like to share with you all before I introduce Mr. Hawkins is to read a land acknowledgement. And some of you may or may not be familiar with land acknowledgements. It's something that I and some of us, we as white people will say in front of a group when we're celebrating or having an event to acknowledge that we're not the first ones to be on this land and occupy it and use it. So I'm going to read the land acknowledgement from the Portland Parks Foundation. The Portland metro area rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. Indigenous people have created communities and summer encampments to harvest and enjoy the plentiful natural resources of the area for the last 11,000 years. We want to recognize that Portland today is a community of many diverse Native peoples who continue to live and work here. We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities, past, present, and future, and are grateful for their ongoing vibrant presence. We also acknowledge the systemic policies of genocide, relocation, and assimilation that still impact many Indigenous and Native American families today. As settlers and guests on this land, we respect the work of Indigenous leaders and families and pledge to make ongoing efforts to recognize their knowledge, creativity, and resilience. Friends of Columbia Parks stands in appreciation of this acknowledgement from Portland Parks Foundation. So it is now my distinct pleasure to introduce and welcome Mr. Hawkins, William J. Hawkins III. He is an architect, an author, a historian, and a lover of the natural world, hailing from Portland, Oregon. And as an architect, William has a particular interest in historic preservation and residential design. Mr. Hawkins has authored 3 books that I'm aware of. The Grand Era of Cast Iron Architecture in Portland, which received a Rounds and Coffin Award. The second book is Classic Houses of Portland, Oregon, 1850 to 1950. And for those of you in the room, these books I'm mentioning are here for you to check out. And then the last book I will mention is The Legacy of the Olmsted Brothers in Portland, Oregon, which is a focus that we'll hear a little more about in just a few minutes from Mr. Hawkins. Another interesting piece about Mr. Hawkins that makes this experience tonight and lecture so relevant and interesting is that his connection to parks in Portland, and that is that William is the great nephew, am I getting that right, of Colonel Lester Leander Hawkins, who was a founding board member of the Portland Park Board, which may be kind of like the equivalent of the Parks Foundation now, but that was a while ago. So also, Colonel Hawkins was a contemporary and a collaborator with Frederick Law Olmsted. The last thing I'd like to say about Mr. Hawkins is that today is a really special day. It is Mr. Hawkins' 86th birthday, and 86. Hopefully, 86. Hopefully when we get to be that honored of an age, it's okay to say the number. So happy birthday, and March 9th is a special day indeed for that reason too. So for those of you in the room, I encourage you to stick around after hearing Mr. Hawkins speak for just a little celebration of this very special day. And so with that, I am just pleased to welcome Mr. Hawkins, and would like to turn it over to you. And please help me welcome Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you very much. Two little notes. I appreciate all that was said. That's very nice of you. My connection, I'd like to believe, is through blood in me, that there was something that was always in our family that loved parks. So that led at a very early age to get out and explore the world. And it led me eventually into the world of parks and the wonderful outdoor world, the whole country, Portland parks, all sorts of parks, state parks, what have you. It's been very much a part of my life. I love the outdoors and always have. The particular connection with parks and the plan that the Olmsted Brothers presented in 1903 is of great interest to me. What is also of great interest is that we are celebrating, although we are celebrating the 100th birthday of the birth of Frederick Law Olmsted, it is John Olmsted that came to Portland. And John was the head of the company, Olmsted Brothers, in 1903, and a very brilliant man, all in his own. We don't have mountains of books written about John C. Olmsted as with his father. We don't have national celebrations about his birth and what have you. But in my heart of hearts, he is the one who came here. He is the one of great genius who not only came west to do park plans for Seattle and Spokane, but endless personal, private projects. He had an amazing capacity for doing work under duress, how he got here on the train, how he got around the cities, how he summed all this up is of phenomenal interest to me. So the title of this talk is The Legacy of Olmsted Brothers in Portland, and it is John C. Olmsted, to whom I pay the most homage. So to have a more personal connection with this guy, this morning I got a photograph of a little horse ring out here somewhere. I don't know where that was. Do you know where that was? Right out here on Lombard. Well, that was for a horse ring, a carriage tie-up, horse tie-up. So on the personal side, and I want you to all feel a little closer to John C. Olmsted, I have an artifact here, which is a tally-ho whip. When Mr. Olmsted came here to Portland, he was led all around by my great uncle in the tally-ho Jupiter, a wonderful just open carriage. But Portland was relatively primitive then. So the roads were not quite in. Apparently the curbs were. I didn't know that. And they toured the city from the northern, almost of the Columbia River, all the way south down to Selwood, which is quite a distance. And from east to west, all the peaks that are in the east side of our city, Rocky Butte, Mount Tabor, all of those places, and up to the top of the Tuolumne Mountains, Council Crest, and around there. Now, the feat of doing that when a lot of roads were not in has always just amazed me. And then within a matter of days, the concept came of a plan for Portland. It ended up in a little booklet, because Portland couldn't afford the full drawings, called The Report of the Park Board, Portland, Oregon, 1903. I have a great appreciation for genius. The fact that he could tour in undoubtedly difficult weather and difficult conditions, sum up the topography, our mountains, the sense of the valley where Portland is, the sense of the foothills, the sense of the scope, and put it all into a concept astounds me within a very short period. He also was charged with planning the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition. The fact that he did this in also a relatively short time, all within the same period of time that he was planning a park for Portland or a park system, I have great respect for that capacity, that giant skill that could sum up the situation and come up with concepts and ideas that are still valid today. So we, with our speaking of genius, we have a wonderful set of technicians here who for the last 45 minutes have performed a minor miracle to make all this work out there, to whom I owe a great appreciation. We're going to start this series now, but at some point I want you to touch the hand or touch the whip that was held by the hand that undoubtedly welcomed John C. Olmsted to Portland in 1903. I want you to feel a connection that he was a guy, he came here, he had great capacities, and we have a Portland plan and a city that very much reflects today some of the concepts that he thought of way back in 1903. So we're going to start our slide presentation. Can you hold it? You can certainly hold it. Bless it. It's an artifact. Oh my goodness, I think it's being passed around. Don't hold it too carefully or too strongly because it's very old. Just a little pat will do. All right, we'll get our click system going here. The Legacy of the Olmsted Brothers in Portland, Oregon is the title of my book that I wrote in 2014. I got very into the subject. You know, there was a lot of information back then about there was national knowledge of the Olmsteds, particularly Frederick Law, and this, of course, is his photograph. But he was a man of extraordinary capacities. How this man, in effect, made our country think of parks in a big way, and the fact that they became essential to the very nature of our country, one of the greatest gifts that we have. It all seems to go back to this man, an amazing feat for his lifetime, and that he celebrated 100 years later for all of these thoughts that he had, for the huge projects that he did, very complicated. He was a planner, a man that was always thinking about how to have a better city. It was the birth of planning. Now, you can imagine Portland didn't really have, it had a map, but it didn't really have a concept of how it was going to grow. It had no concept of parks except the lineal parks, strip of parks by the Art Museum, and the two plaza blocks that were in the original 1950 Brady plan for Portland. It had practically nothing. But let's have the briefest review. You've heard from Larry Cotton, who gave you enormous detail about Frederick Law Olmsted. Click. Sorry, we haven't quite got our system straight. Click. And I don't know if you've all been to Central Park in New York, but to think this came out of the mind of Olmsted and Fox at the time, his partner, this absolutely huge, wonderful mini adventure, some full park, almost a symbol of New York. And they did this way back in the 1850s and 60s. It's just a remarkable feat. Of course, the genius of the plan was able to make it so natural that all the streets that went through the park are under tunnels and whatever, not tunnels, but you're not aware of all that at all, that the city functions through the park. It is nature. It is the essence of nature. Now, what came to be a part of his major philosophy was there's a tremendous quality about the nature itself, that it is a healing element. In days when most of the public did not have access to anything at all, to have a public park open to everybody, to go right in the middle all by yourself and say, this is partially owned by me, it's a public park, everyone is welcome. Well, that concept simply didn't exist prior to that. Now, he got a lot of inspiration from England. The sense of greenery, slightly controlled, landscape, lawns, trees, spaces, streams, nature, was only enjoyed by the really upper class. The great estates had plans that had, of course, a magnificent mansion in the middle of a beautiful lawn and trees. This was available only to them, only the very rich. But then it came to London and public parks, the same concept of you can walk into a public park, such as Hyde Park, and feel the blessing of nature all around you, that it in itself has a healing capacity that is wonderful. Now, I felt that all my life. You know, I've climbed, I've hiked, I've mountain climbed, I've done all those things in the city, outside the city. The peaks I've climbed, the freedom that you get from being in nature where every worry that you might have falls away. And you simply absorb the goodness of being there, the sense of beauty, the sense of greenery. Just breathe it in deeply. Now, I don't know if you've had experiences like that, but my great uncle Esther Leander Hawkins fully experienced. He was a great outdoorsman. And one experience is told about him that he would be out in the middle of nature, just kind of be overwhelmed by the beauty of it all, and would give out a yell that could be heard all around the valley from the pure pleasure of being there. Now, that's not the usual experience for someone going into a park, but you can be there by yourself and say, oh my God, I forgot all my worries. Isn't this wonderful? I feel better. So let's go on. This is 1858, you can imagine, way back then. And Prospect Park came in the 70s. The firm was extremely well known by then, very prosperous. But a similar concept is in Prospect Park too. There are the open spaces with lawns, always surrounded by trees, much like Little Columbia Park here. They tended to put the trees at the perimeter of the park, and all the other functions were kind of tucked away. But no matter what exercises they offered or other events, it was essentially a nature experience. The beauty of nature, the healing sense of nature, it's something we all know from time to time. And this concept was just fully developed at the time. Next slide. Of course, the firm had huge prominence. And when it came to some of the most important projects in the country, such as landscaping the national capital, they were called to resolve this problem. It has some similar aspects: lawns, perimeter trees, very nicely planned walkways, a lot of circular surrounds of spaces. But the wonderful thing they did is put the Capitol building on a bit of a podium. So as a national symbol, it assumes with its lawns, with its landscaping, a really awesome vision as a symbol for our country. I have toured all this when I was a member of the board, of the National Board of Olmsted Parks, and I can't tell you how wonderful experience that was to go around and see a lot of these projects. Next, please. They did a lot of private commissions, and always the very best of them, incorporating what would be a very private experience in those days, but they're very elegant mansions. This is Biltmore Estate in 1893. The whole property, Olmsted was thought of as a place to develop the whole field of horticultural and forest and planning, and it is still that today. I've toured this, and a lot of those endless parks. Of course, it has the typical aspects of the peacefulness of a lake, a lot of lawns, huge trees. Next, please. The great outdoors, the fact that Frederick Law Olmsted was in Mariposa at the time, as he was organizing a large mineral company there. This is after the Civil War, and wandered into Yosemite Valley with his family. John C. Olmsted was very young at this time, but he must have felt the power, the great power of nature in an extraordinary circumstance. A beautiful, beautiful valley with rocks and waterfalls, the whole bit. How this should really be a national experience. Everyone should be able to enjoy something wonderful. Now, this was an era of great competing needs. Of course, everyone wanted to use the minerals in the park or mine it, or do a million things were offered for all the lands that eventually became national parks. But he was, in 1865, right after the Civil War, he was to recommend this park to President Lincoln, and indeed it eventually became a park in 1906. But I have been to those spots. They are indeed awesome. My great uncle just happened to grow up in a ranch on the other side of this mountain pass. So, and he was a bit older than Olmsted, but when they met here in Portland, how they must have looked back to their youth and being in that wonderful, wonderful space of Yosemite Valley is indeed a miracle of places. I have a photograph in the family collection of a trip my great uncle took there in 1870, and it is in that location, looking at one of the waterfalls on this side, that they met John Muir. And of course, the whole national park system was in Muir's mind, and particularly Yosemite. But Muir eventually came to Portland, was a friend of LL's. A lot of these people got to know each other. The whole concept of parks as a wonderful thing in the United States, I'm sure was just endorsed by all of them in a great big way. Next, please. Well, we're back to Portland. Portland was founded in the early 1850s. The first Brady plan for the city, next please, had park blocks in it. The long row of blocks that goes across the city from north to south. It didn't all develop that way, but it also had the plaza blocks, which are two squares that show right in sort of the middle and off to the left there. Portland was a very conservative little city, but it aimed high, and many of its founding fathers knew the plazas, the little plazas on the East Coast, and I think those elements were in the first plans of Portland. But Portland wanted to think bigger. Next, please. And as the years developed, the plaza blocks here became the center of our government in the town. Very handsome little squares that were developed as time went on. Extremely wonderful thing to have in our city. Its first parks put there in a plan the year Portland was established. Next, please. Of course, the other one is the South Park blocks, a few blocks to the west, a long strip, only 100 feet wide. They were very simple in the beginning. Commonwealth Avenue was about the same size in Boston. Maybe it was planned to be like that, we don't know, but it was very much a promenade that went through the city. These were the things that were here when John Olmsted came to Portland. They did have nothing beyond all this. Ocean Park was totally undeveloped. It wasn't even called that then. Next, please. The park blocks today is just, I think, quite an extraordinary space. It still has its 5 rows of trees with a simple lawn that goes a long strip to the city. Very popular park. I can't tell you how lucky we are to have such a thing right in the middle of our downtown. Next, please. Washington Park was City Park in its first days. It was purchased by the city in 1871. in a rather curious location. It was on a hill that came out of the city to the west, but its entrances were off of Burnside up through a canyon to the top of the hill, and off of Jefferson or Canyon on the other side of the hill to the south. It was also a steep road that went up there, very hard to access. So when Olmsted came to town, next slide, he devised a whole new entrance to the park, which came up the much more gentle slope of Kings Hill from downtown, around where Salmon is today, and eventually came up a Park Place and bifurcated around the top of this hill. And they celebrated this entrance in 1903 by putting a monument there dedicated to Lewis and Clark, but it very much says entrance to the park, and it's a very gracious entrance to our, still one of our great parks. Next, please. This is the park before Olmsted made his changes off of enormous lithograph, but it shows that the park was not developed. It had two reservoirs in it, which were necessary for the city water, the Bull Run water that came by gravity down in the city, but was in these reservoirs and others on Mount Tabor. When Olmsted reviewed all this, it was at that time that he thought a new entrance and a more picturesque one was required. Next, please. This is one of those reservoirs. It's gone through an enormous transformation today because of a giant landslide problem. So they've revised the whole area, buttressed it, and the little reservoirs will have a different view, but they're still there. But Olmsted was intrigued with this park. He only designed the entrance part of it. Next, please. We had a few other treasures in Portland when he came to town. The Skidmore Fountain of 1888 by a national artist who did it. It's one of the more lovely statues, I think, on the West Coast, or fountains. And we had one other fountain. Next slide, please. The cast iron fountain up in Moynihan Park. There weren't a lot of amenities and certainly no concept of a broader park plan. Next, please. Well, when they started to think big, it was the late 1890s that the first Parks Board was founded. And of great fortune was the fact that Reverend Eliot of the Unitarian Church had a brother in the Olmsted firm, a partner in the firm. And unfortunately, he died, but they very, very much knew of this connection to the Olmsted firm. And the Parks Board decided to think big. If we were going to have a park system in a very fast growing system, we needed expertise to give us some guidance. So Mr. Eliot went back east to visit the firm, visit some of their parks. And next slide, please. This is Dr. Eliot, who was a great treasure in the city of Portland. He was highly respected, was involved with a lot of the civic improvements that were made in the city, and all the social amenities were added. The philanthropic organizations of the city on a lot of boards. Very interesting man, and he wanted to do his part, so he was a member of the first park board. Next slide, please. Another very important person in this whole development of parks was Ion Lewis, who had done work in the East Coast before he came to Portland to supervise the building of the Portland Hotel, a huge terminal hotel for the railroad that was to come through. But he was undoubtedly the man that did a lot of the sketching of the early concepts and was deeply involved with the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exhibition. Probably drew many of their drawings while Mr. Olmsted was here. Next slide, please. And of course, have to go back one. There was my great uncle, Lester Leander Hawkins. Now, he was gone long before I came into the world, but he still had a was referred to in the family in an extraordinary way. Big outdoorsman, always climbing mountains, endless feats. He started a museum for the city, very involved with his early planning and very, very involved with the early parks development. Being a nature man, he had established a lot of trails. Next slide, please. A trail system, the McClay Park trails, and personally got up there and helped dig them out of the hillside. These are the trails that were available to John C. Olmsted when he came to Portland. Going up McClay Canyon, the whole area there, the beginnings of Forest Park greatly impressed Olmsted. He very much wanted to have a plan, a city plan that incorporated these wonderful natural features that were here. Next slide. Well, the Portland Parks plan, or the plan that he presented, was only in a little booklet. Portland could not afford the full drawings that would normally be required. The report of the Park Board, Portland, Oregon, 1903. But the newspapers were able to get the concept of the plan, and they printed the whole darn thing in the Oregonian. They also proceeded to do maps interpreting what he had said. Next slide, please. They went around, Olmsted and John C. Olmsted, my great uncle, went around the city in this tally-ho Jupiter, and that's the tally-ho whip that's somewhere now, back there. So you have to imagine that whip in this photograph somewhere, and that's my great uncle at the head of the team of horses. You have to imagine Mr. Olmsted from Boston, very proper and always dressed to the nines. And my great uncle, I don't know how they managed to be so outdoorsy in Portland at that time, but just the distance they covered in that tally-ho is just amazing. And you know, we drive here in the center of town, but imagine taking a little tally-ho on very rough roads. And if there were any hills to climb, they climbed them. There wasn't always a road up there, but maybe a trail. And the weather was always iffy. So this is the tally-ho Jupiter. So we're going to switch a little bit to what he was doing while he was in Portland. Next slide. This is John C. Olmsted, very Bostonian in his appearance, fastidious. He apparently had several wardrobes or huge luggage that they brought, came by train, and was prepared for every possible situation. But he had to draw, he had to think, he had to write letters. He brought all that paraphernalia with him when he was in Portland. I have visited where he lived, near where he lived, a lovely part of outside Boston. I would love to know the man. We only know him through his letters and stories that we hear. Next slide. The first project he had in Portland was, of course, the Lewis and Clark Centennial exhibition. The site was to be selected, which it was very quickly, but they had no maps of the area. He had to redo any rough information he was given. And this site, which is where Montgomery Ward used to be, or now Montgomery Park, was just a bluff overlooking the little lakes of the Giles Lake down below it. It was, they first thought they would try to make it a permanent park, but they were only able to get the land for kind of a lease for just the exhibition. And within days, he came up with a plan for the exhibition. And they started immediately on all the things they had to do, the planning, the exhibits, whatever had to be there. Next slide. And it was a very successful exhibition. My family went there and bought a few souvenirs at the time. My father was only a baby then, but there are some things they bought there that are still around in the family. Well, you have to imagine coming up with the concept of this. It was sort of a Columbia exhibition in miniature of Chicago, but it had amazing outlooks toward the lakes down below, the government buildings, distant views of the mountain, a grand entrance colonnade as you came in, huge buildings for exhibitions of every sort. And miraculously, they got this done by 1905, the centennial of the Lewis and Clark exhibition west. This rendering was probably done by Ion Lewis. He was the talent in town at the time, or his firm was. It's a wonderful, wonderful vision. I would love to wander the grounds of this and see what was there. Next slide. In all his wanderings around the landscape of Portland, every place he went seemed to suggest a park. But Little Willamette Park was one of the few he visited, never drew a plan for it, but said it's filled with ancient oak trees that were here when the country was founded. He said, this must be a park. It took years for just that idea to take hold. But it's that type of influence that he had, knowing immediately that this was a great place for a little park, and it's there today. It's not a huge park. Some of the oaks are still standing, which is amazing to me. I went there the other day, and one had recently fallen in. It was absolutely huge. So it must have been one of the ones that were there. Slowly, they've disappeared. The park has, it's a wonderful place to be on a summer night. The whole development of the river he wanted to put into his plan. But of course, that's where all the industry of the city was. Everyone, well, a lot of the jobs in Portland depended upon it being a harbor and all those ships coming in. All our shipping was right there, backed up to the riverfront down on Front Street, right in the middle of town. Well, he couldn't say this should all go for a park, but he did say general statements that you should develop your river as time permits it. Slowly but surely, that has happened. We have absolutely wonderful parks along the river now. Next slide. The plan that he did, the first in the Oregonian, is from the concepts in this little book. Everyone who has read this little book would have a different interpretation. But if there are generalities, and I'd love to take the word and draw it myself, but there were some things that were general that they pulled out of it. There would be parks all over the city. The better ones would be connected by boulevards. The plan would take advantage of all the scenic locations in the city. In other words, the Mount Scott, Mount Tabor, Rocky Butte, Council Crest, all the places that were very iconic to the city should be developed as parks. Well, this is long before anything happened, but that was all in the plan. The riverfront is just suggested here because everybody, the great wealth and the jobs all rested on the ships being right smack in the middle of the city. But they did, Ross Island is shown here and Swan Island as parks. Mike Hauk here, we're very glad to have this evening, who has championed Ross Island as a park for years and years and years. Well, of course, it became the gravel was mined when it was privately owned. It has largely disappeared. It is still a spectacular kind of lagoon surrounded by its original park, island sides. It is going to be, it is someday going to be a part of the parks. And Mike is greatly responsible for that. Well, on the west side of the city, to the left in the map, you can vaguely see what has become Forest Park. Well, it was just a kind of a small section on this large plan, but that was one of the concepts that he wanted added, that this was a huge natural park and should be incorporated into the park system. You see the black lines going along on the west side of the river. On the left, that was a string of parks that, it was just a concept at the time, but now there are trails through all those hills. They're connected from the very northern part of Forest Park all the way through down to Riverview Cemetery. There are trails all through that. It was just suggested as a concept in this plan. A lot of the boulevards did not get put in. Terwilliger was one of the concepts that he had in his plan. And by miracle, it did eventually become a scenic boulevard on the west side of the river. Willamette Boulevard, right out here at your front door, was also in the plan. And of course, it's a long, scenic, linear drive. I don't know how far he planned to take it. It looks enormous in the drawing, but it would eventually connect across to other city parks and more or less circle the city. They went all the way north to the sloughs of the Columbia River, and it was suggested that that was a great scenic area that ought to be part of our park plan. Much of it is today. I can't think what else was conceptual at the time, but it put an idea in Portland's head that we should have a giant interconnected park system, and indeed we have that today. So this little plan played a big role. Now, a lot of other groups have taken off from this. The bike routes around the city, are fulfilling that in their own ways. And I've tried to see all these parks when I was working on the book. There are, of course, miles and miles of them. My wife would let me out, and I just go for a long time, and she'd have to pick me up somewhere. But it's impossible to cover all these if you're just a city hiker. Next slide. The 18 recommendations for a complete park system are what are in this little book, and terribly unusual. This was the first time that a series of concepts for a park system were ever written down. Now, you would think that'd be something you'd learn in any university if you were studying landscape architecture. Well, there was no such thing at the time. But he devised this list with all these suggestions of what a good park system would be. And in fact, this little report written here in Portland, Oregon, was the basis of the whole firm philosophy for parks development. It went into the academic world. So Portland has a sort of an unsung role in being the first park system, the first time they put down into writing the general requirements for parks. Parks connected by boulevards and parkways and what have you. They're all up there. Next slide. Terwilliger Parkway, the Terwilliger family gave a tract of land, and as was done in the early days of the city, people knew we needed a park system, and if they were generous, they gave land for the development of that system. Terwilliger family were one of those families, as the McClays were, who gave McClay Park. But it was a challenging situation to put a boulevard, a scenic boulevard through it, because it had so many canyons, wonderful canyons. And somehow to provide this roadway at one level above the city, a scenic level connecting the downtown part of the city to areas south of the city. Capitol Highway is what it was in this plan. Now, when I went back to Fairstead, where the Olmsted office is still, they miraculously pulled out of a drawer this plan done by the Olmsted firm. But as things went, it was actually the parks superintendent, Misch, who came to Portland at their recommendation, who drew up the plan the total plan that we eventually followed. But the firm was deeply involved. And the reason that happened is that they found that when they hired Misu's suggestion of a park superintendent, that he had all the talents that the Olmsted firm had. And if they hired him just for his salary, they could get free the best of the Olmsted firm's advice. So we were able to profit by that. The same happened to Columbia Park here. The park was visited first by Olmsted and brought into the park system a bit later. He came here to this property, but it was Mish from his firm who eventually became the park superintendent that did the first parks plan. It's over there on the wall, that drawing. Next slide, please. Tullager Boulevard today, if you haven't biked it or hiked it, is just a lovely feature of the whole park system. And to know that the trails that go off of this go up to Council Crest, go down to the river, it's all interconnected. You could spend days on these trails and never see a house. Well, if you're careful and work on it. But the fact that this was completed it's a very positive thing for Portland thinking big, trying to do the right thing. My family's father drove to the opening ceremonies of Tullager Boulevard and were there when they finally opened it many, many years later. Next slide. While John C. Olmsted was here, he was asked to get involved with a lot of district developments around the city. Well, he was able to do this quickly and meet all of these various people who wanted to develop their tracts. Portland was growing very fast and really needed a good plan. But the Laurelhurst addition to the city of Portland, he had been asked by the Law Brothers to think of concepts for this. It had a little lake on it, which he liked very much. So he drew quickly, amazingly quickly, a plan that followed all the contours of the hills out there with boulevards and laid out basic concepts of a very unified and gorgeous residential area. The lake was put in, but the Ladd brothers sold their property and the developer did not hire the Olmsted firm. So Olmsted's plan was used, a very rough one, almost exactly as he sketched it. To my mind, to be able to come out here, visit the property, draw up a plan that survived the selling of the property, that somehow was built, is just this stupendous talent to me. Amazing feat. Next slide. Improvements to Vista Avenue. It was a growing residential area, but it had very bad access. It came up Montgomery Drive and Market Street Drive, which is very narrow and kind of perilous. But the plan was to come up across Kings Hill from, say, Burnside or downtown Portland, gently ascend the hill and connect into one of the streets that were already there. Well, this plan had grand ambitions. Of course, as you come up Vista Avenue, the city is all out in front of you. It's absolutely gorgeous. You're very close to the downtown, but right above it. So he planned a parkway on the city side of Tullager Boulevard and with a lookout there and trail system that went down into the city. An amazing concept. Well, Portlanders are always thinking high. By the 30s or whatever, the property was sold as extra property, not needed, and the park became apartment houses. Very, very sad. But those beautiful features of a city, the aspects where you can actually drive up a street, as you do many of them, see the mountains, see the city, was a wonderful feature, and I'm very sorry it never happened. It was sold at sheriff's auction, so you suspect something very sinister was going on. Next slide. Another of the residential areas is, it's called Mount Zion Addition at the time, but it's Green Hills today. Very much meandering streets, no sidewalks in this case, but it became a very popular residential area way at the top of Council, near Council Crest. Next slide. Some of his private gardens are still there today, which amazes me. Peter Kerr was quite an outdoor man and a botanist, I believe, and had an estate above where the Willamette River looks over to, it's a residential area on the other side. I can't think what's near it. But this was family property that he wanted to develop into an estate. Well, Olmsted visited him many times and came up with some concepts, but again, it was Misch who drew up the plan because he was here. Next slide, please. And the Cicero Hunt Gardens are still there today, which is quite amazing. I visited the estate when it was for sale, and almost everything that he planned is intact. Next slide, please. And of course, Waverly Country Club, he brought in a new entrance for them. It was much more graceful than the rough roads that were there before. But he was able to adapt a new entrance and relocated the clubhouse, which is the one that's there today. This is about 1912. Next slide, please. Westover was another addition, a very difficult hillside addition to the city, but some of the basic concepts of curvilinear roads, tree-lined avenues, and beautiful lots overlooking the city. It has become a very successful area of the city. Next slide, please. And another private garden, I have two more. It's the Cameron Squires house. It's now owned by Lewis and Clark College as a home for their president. But this is the type of private garden where the extensive lawns, absolutely gorgeous trees, ancient trees. You walk into the middle of it and say, oh my goodness, this is a bit of paradise. This is the private experience that the Olmsted firm brought into the park world with open spaces, gorgeous old trees, sense of nature that everyone can enjoy. Next slide. One last major house that he did, the Hamilton Corbett Mansion, vast house, vast lawns. At the time, it had every amenity you can imagine. But while he was here, he did a lot of private commissions and college campuses and what have you around the Northwest. The plans for Seattle and Spokane are literal plans. You can see them. The city has taken every advantage of those plans. They've developed their cities with the Olmsted Parks at an amazing scale. They have Friends of Olmsted groups. They're very solidly protecting those amenities of those other cities. But the name Olmsted means everything to them. Now, Seattle, I don't know if you visited them, but I was privileged to go up there, and the Friends of Seattle gave me a wonderful tour of these parks, as well as a picnic. It was very, very nice. And the enthusiasm for the name Olmsted is just extraordinary. Now, we have to remember this is John C. Olmsted, who came to the Northwest. His father died just before this little plan was published. And I don't know how, in such a national celebration, we bring in his stepson, John C., but all of us know that he was the one that came to Portland. And his genius, I think, is yet to be fully brought to the public's attention. It's an amazing man. I would love to be able to have a little chat with these folks. Wish that we could go back and somehow hold that tally-ho whip and get a sense of the original guy. I would love to hear the conversations about the city, how it's being developed. There was a map that went around with them on their explorations, and I think it is the map they used to go where they were going, because there are little red pochette lines where all the parks eventually were located. That map is now in part of the collection, my great uncle's collection at the City Archives building. But that personal connection of LL with the development of where these sites were, taking him around to all of these places in Jupiter, I would like to remember as a very wonderful experience in the city. Next slide, please. These are slides of Portland Parks. Remember one of the Olmsted recommendations that they be varied, make the parks totally take advantage of their local sites, but make them unique to each other so they're not a repetition of all the same things. So we're going to go through those very quickly. Many of these are plans that were actually drawn by Emanuel Miche from the Olmsted firm with the training of the Olmsted office with drawings that looked remarkably similar. They had a clarity of understanding as drawings. You could always read a good drawing from a distance. It could be on a wall and everyone understand where the meadow was, where the lawn was, where the trees were, where the amenities were. It's all in this little book where it started. Next, please. This is Emanuel T. Miche. We're lucky to have so many geniuses in the world, people with great visions. But he came from the Miche office and all his training, thoroughly imbued with what the firm was doing, that these were parks for everybody, the essence of a democratic plus for our country. But he didn't come until 1908. It took a while for Portland to pull it together. You have to remember it was growing very quickly, but they were also dealing with a lot of very conservative people in the city. What do we need parks for? Go a mile out here and you're in the middle of nature. No imagination whatsoever. But Miche arrived and had to deal with all that. Part of his training would be how to deal with difficult clients and how to sell the big idea. This is the only photograph I have of Emanuel Miche. He lived in a little cottage up in what is now Washington Park. And he's kind of a minor legend in this whole story, but another brilliant man. Next slide. He redrew the Olmsted plan of 1903. Again, you can see, fortunately, these have very black areas where the park systems are. You can see on the west side of the city, on the left-hand side, there's a continuous row of parks that come down to even go further south in the cityscape. And way up where the Columbia meets the Willamette, a lot of advantage of those sloughs, all would be part of the park system. You can only see the islands in this case as developed parkland, but where the downtown is, the avenues connected to the original park blocks, it was all interconnected, plus a series of avenues that were planned, and many of them started, but it never came to pass that they were all put in. You can see large parks out there on Columbia. You can see Mount Tabor. You can see, I'm not quite sure what some of them are, but they were all over the city. They were evenly scattered. There were a lot of them. You could walk to your neighborhood park, took advantage of all the local hillsides, hills, views, whatever. So it was refreshed in 1908 by Emanuel Miche. Next slide, please. Of course, Peninsula Park is a real treasure. It's a much more developed park and a site of local rose gardens. But this is a very elegant park, a nice pavilion, an open place, beautiful old trees now. It's been very carefully tended by its friends group. Next slide. Ladd Circle was a relatively small park. The circular inner part where all the X's meet in the middle of the developed addition, but is treasured by the residents of Ladd's addition. They love that little park. They love their trees. They defend it fiercely to try to keep what they want, the amenities of it. Next part planned. Little Kenilworth Park had rather an odd topography to it. But as a neighborhood park, it is just a dear little place. It kind of feels out in nature. It's removed. When you're in the middle of the park, you have no idea there's a residential area around it. The amenities are fairly discreet today. It needs some upkeep with the buildings that were built. All of these parks have a lot of buildings that the city park system has simply not taken care of. They're either abandoned or just off the list of maintenance. It's a huge problem all around our city. They don't take care of their buildings. Next slide, please. Selwood Park on the bluff above Oaks Park, the Willamette River. It had been a racetrack in the early days, so it was an open space, and everyone knew it. Olmsted suggested a boulevard that go along the bluff. Part of it was developed a little bit, but it never became the grand scenic boulevard that Olmsted imagined. It is an extraordinary little park. I really like it a lot. Beautiful ball field there. Lovely public buildings. There's an aquatic center there. There's a very handsome building, also in need of care. Fortunately, it's had huge benefactors that have, the Columbia Sportswear have put a lot of money into this little park. Their business is not too far away. But it has many of the concepts: an open place, places to play, other amenities, plus this incredible outlook over the Willamette River down below to Oaks Park and Oaks Bottom, which Mr. Houck also knows a great deal about. Next slide. Laurelhurst Park developed as part of the whole Laurelhurst addition to the city of Portland. When J.C. Olmsted first talked to the Ladd brothers, they're kind of non-committal about this area that was already there, about including it as an amenity of the addition. Somehow they were convinced that this would be the amenity that would make the district. And indeed, his idea survived and was a part of it. It's a lovely little park, just really nice areas of it, open spaces, kind of dells, paths in the woods, a very handsome park if you haven't been over there. Next slide. When Misch was designing the greater plans for Portland, he had a lot of tree-lined boulevards planned for the city. Omaha Avenue and Ainsworth Street were another of those plans that were very, it was to be the lineal connection of all the parks throughout the city. And they're just remnants today. They never became a connecting park system, but they're very much admired by the neighbors out there. We appreciate them. Next slide, please. Of course, one of the great parks in the city, Mount Tabor, had its reservoirs, and Misch designed a brilliant road system that went up to the top with a great views out over the city. Views were always important in those park plans. But if you follow the old roads going up and follow the experience and get to the top, it's just everything about it. It's just a beautiful experience. It's as popular today as it ever was. They've taken care of their parks, but although their park buildings need some attention. Next slide. This is the Ross Island that Mike has championed so much. The fact that it most likely will become a park someday is due to his huge efforts on its behalf. He's taken lots of groups out there. He's tried to convince everyone in town that this should be gifted to the city as a park. And I think it will be. When Misch designed a park for it, it was much more formal. It was a whole island. So it had a lot of amenities, big open lawns, lots of trees. But we take what's left, which is just a surrounding of the island's border. But it's still, to canoe in that area, it's amazing the birds that are there. and that sense of nature and being away, it could be an unbelievable city amenity. Even at the way it is now, it could be made more attractive, but there are beaches in there. It's just an amazing place. Next slide. By 1913, there were big plans for Portland. Portland always wanted to do it right, but didn't always come through with it. This was the Bennett plan of Portland, which completely reconfigured everything, but it made Portland very much a Paris of the West. And of course, it never came to be. Some of the concepts of developing the river were incorporated here. Next slide, please. Columbia Park, of course. Bravo, moment of great applause for Columbia Park. The plan for it is that Misch did in 1914 is very, very similar. It's got some differences though, but he promoted the open space. It had been planted with other trees, as I understand it, and he felt that having an open space was really important to the future of the park, so they took out those trees. And the Olmsted concepts are all there. You go out in the middle of this park, you don't feel like you're in the middle of the city. You don't really see the city. You can breathe deeply and know this is yours. This is your park. So we're most appreciative for Columbia Park. It has some of the pure Olmsted ideas. If you have any thoughts or questions, that's all I know about Olmsted Park. Columbia Park, I mean. Next slide. Lentz Park has gone through all the throes that park systems run into, but it has similar concepts. It has a higher level with the lawns and the trees, a kiddies baseball area, very simple, very, very popular. The people of Lentz greatly love it. When I was on the Parks board, I don't know how it got in the door, but those who wanted to build a baseball stadium on the site were allowed to make their presentation, and we all listened. And those of us who like to ask questions said, you have the approval of Lentz Park? You know, you're drastically changing this park. They said, oh, it's all there. Well, for instance, you have a parking lot where the soccer fields are. Oh, well, they will be that grass green. You'll still see green. Isn't the park behind those trees in your drawing, you know, gone? That's a stadium behind those trees. Well, the people out here loved our idea. We'll bring lots of jobs. These type of people get into our park system. They want to use them for their own purposes, and that's always money to earn money for them and to help with our parks. How Parks allowed this guy to speak in front of the Parks board, of which I'm sitting there, kind of aghast at the whole thing, and even make the presentation. He should have said, out. They should have said, out, don't even come into our premise. So these dangers are always there. I think the most poignant meeting I ever attended, somehow I got to a meeting out in the Lentz area. And of course, all the community was there. They were all incensed. And the guys were making this elaborate, very expensive presentation saying how wonderful it would be for the community. And here we started complaining loudly on the Parks board, but it took a guy in a wheelchair who finally said, what are you doing? You're making a ball stadium for your profit with our park. Out. And another gal stood up and said, anyone who thinks this plan put in front of us has any merit whatsoever and should be tossed out, follow me. And the whole audience got up and left the room. I was never so impressed with the human species in my life. It was a great moment for parks, but that's the bravery you have to have if you're a local group defending your park. Some people don't care. The park is there to put their building in, to put their school in. Whatever it is, it's their use, private use for earning money or whatever. It's not for the purpose of the park. So vigilant groups have to be connected with every park. And I greatly applaud all those who have signed their name to that. Next slide, please. Next slide. Well, the park system has just rolled along. Some areas have worked out very well. Dunaway Park is where the Markham Gulch used to be. And as the city expanded and went south, there was this huge gully there with some wooden trestles over it and the railroad trestle that brought the train into town. Well, when that was filled in, it connected with Terwilliger Park. So the whole thing is just a wonderful park. Ball fields are down here, soccer fields are down here, and it's kind of the entrance to Terwilliger, which just goes out and out and out. And there are great running lanes out there. It is a beloved part of Portland's park system. Next slide. The riverfront. Now, Olmsted, as I had mentioned, found that all our business was centered on the docks in front of downtown Portland. He couldn't make a suggestion there that was really worthy of a park that, or a system that loved its river or went back to its river. But other areas have taken seed all along it. Powers Marine Parks, a series of parks that kind of come down through Willamette Park and this park and that. There's a trail system that goes all the way into North Portland. So it is developing as a continuous park. Not all lawns and glorious trees. It goes through some miscellaneous developments, but the concept is there. Next part, next plan. The boulevard system. Some of these I wish I had in different order, but the boulevard system, this is Overlook Park, kind of south of here. Those parks have spectacular views. They're very, very popular. Now, just to go up there and sit on a bench and look out over the river, the passing industrial area down below, Forest Park on the other side of the river, you kind of feel this plan as it was intended and slowly filling in. The ideas were so good that they just had to come to be in some areas. There's nothing like a really good idea that can be developed over a century or so and still come to be and be a benefit to the city. Well, there are a whole series of parks there now, and they're wonderful, and I salute them. Next slide. Council Crest. That they toured up there. They must have walked up there. I can't imagine there were a road up there at that era. But it has great views of the mountains, which are all delineated. It once had an amusement park up there. But that came to be as a city park, very much as Olmsted would have wanted, taking advantage of your natural features and for everybody to enjoy. And they do. Next slide. Rocky Butte, that's a great hike if you haven't been over there. It has wonderful rock work going all around it. These incredible views of the mountain in the distance. This is as it ought to be. All these natural features in the city are public for everyone to enjoy. Next slide. The Pittock Mansion was actually Henry Pittock's private property. And after he died, it became a part of the Portland Park system. But it too has all these wonderful views. It has the amenity of this huge mansion in the background. So it tells a story up there. It's a wonderful piece of architecture. And of course, as the mansion was laid out, the dining room looks at this mountain, the main music room looks at that mountain, and so on and so forth. It took full advantage of the site. So as a tourist, as a visitor, seeing the city, checking out these amenities that once were privately owned, but now are part of the public experience, is a great addition. And of course, its trail system goes all the way through its Forest Park, up through the backyard of the Pittock Mansion, crosses the canyon of the freeways, all the way up to Council Crest, and then all the way to Riverview Cemetery and the parks down there. So some of these concepts have come through. They're great amenities for Portland. Next slide. this was Willamette. This is Willamette Boulevard. I can't read that very well. But it was his statement in this little book that these picturesque drives ought to be in scenic places, and they ought to connect parks and be available to everybody. This is the 1970s that this was actually, this section was put in. But next slide. And the riverfront. Now this was all deep commercial docks, warehouses, what have you, along Front Avenue in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, what have you. The buildings, it wasn't developed as a park until way up in the 1970s. But of course, on this side, the Vercats Park, on the other side, at long last, Portland has come back to its river, and they are great features of the city. I've walked many times along there. Some of the competing interests, I don't seem to hear bikers when they come up behind me. Boy, they can almost, is being resolved now. They're taking the bikers off the public walkway, people walkway, and putting it on the inside on what was Front Avenue. Next slide. Of course, Cathedral Park, the mere fact of this giant bridge up ahead with its Gothic arches, you know, is an extraordinary opportunity for a public park. And it is a miraculous little sight if you've ever been to a concert out there. It's wonderful. There's something about that Gothic arch that is very moving. They've taken, of course, they've named it after that, but it's a very popular park to the Columbia River. We are getting there, slowly but surely. Our river is going to be one of our main park features. Next slide. And of course, if you go all the way out to Kelly Park, you can hardly believe that there's an area that looks very much as it did when Lewis and Clark paddled by. People walk their dogs there. It's just out in the middle. It's just way out there. And here it is, part of this park system. Of course, they have an inner park that has ball fields and things like that. But it's a miracle of being on that beach on a sunny day with huge ships going by of giant scale, that it makes it just a fun place to be. There's also a new beach if you're into that. Next slide. Oaks Bottom, Mike has championed this for years and years and years. It is now part of the park system. The whole bike routes that go along the trail system out there, go along the river, it goes on for miles and miles and miles. But the fact that this takes, this is our wildlife refuge. It is just a gorgeous spot to be. You could spend a whole life exploring our public parks, and there's every variety you can possibly imagine. Next slide. And of course, the Springwater Corridor. It was an old railroad, interurban railroad line, and it is now a bike route, a people walking route. Also houses a lot of homeless. But it's a great feature of our park system. This is where I think they had a little water control feature. Beautiful stonework, but it's all part of the park today. Next slide. This is getting up quite recently. Of course, Vercats, Esplanade, all those wonderful views out over the river to the city. Very, very popular. We're just so glad that these concepts are of such power that years and years later, they can be put in the city. And I think people feel this tie going back to 1903. It was an ingenious plan. Next slide. Of course, we have every variety, the Japanese garden, choice garden. If you happen to enjoy Japanese gardens, it's one of the best in the world. And the fact it was on our old zoo property with all these huge old trees. If you want variety in parks and a totally different experience, I highly recommend the Portland Japanese Garden. It's first class. I've been to our sister city, where they have ancient private gardens. And in workmanship, in what they've done, and the selection of trees, the variety of spaces, so lucky to have that in our system. And of course, after the war with Japan, to have, after that, this glorious park in the middle of our midst. There's a huge cultural tie to Japan today because of this. Next slide. And of course, the Lanshu Chinese garden. I got my parks a little mixed up. I went to China and saw the gardens that influenced this. I went to gardens in Japan that influenced our Japanese garden. A little too much going on here. Next slide. Well, this is the man in his studio, John C. Olmsted. Now, this is the centennial, the 100th year of his father. Us forever and amen. It is John C. who is our hero. He came to Portland in 1903. So it's a salute to all those who enjoyed our park system, his early plan, those who championed the local parks, all of them. No, it's a celebration of all that, all in one big package. I see a hand back there. Yeah.
I'm confused about where the lakes were, where the exposition was held.
Yes, Gosley.
And repeat the question for our online.
Well, what was the actual question?
Where's the location of the exposition?
Oh, okay. Do you know where the old Montgomery Ward building used to be?
In Northwest.
In Northwest Portland. It's now Montgomery Park. That was where the buildings were of the exhibition. It's on a cliff, it's on a butte sort of above what was a whole series of lakes that fed off the Willamette River, wetlands and what have you. And unfortunately, as a park, it never developed. But when they leveled the hillsides to make residential areas, they slushed all this soil down into the old lakes and filled it up. So it's industrial land today, very important industrial land, but that's where it was. Yeah.
What's your favorite Olmsted Park?
Oh my goodness.
Would you repeat the question?
What's your favorite Olmsted Park?
Yeah.
Well, I think they all kind of mesh into one. And it's kind of an essential truth that nature is really good. It's something we should all enjoy. I would wish everyone the experience of walking into a beautiful place outdoor. I really wish them a good experience. Wish them a healing experience. That nature has a lesson to offer in mental health and physical health. It's there to be appreciated and worked on and improved. If you can, and it's a local scale, it's down by the river, it's in our state system, and it's in our national system. I think this is one of the great additions to our country is its park system, no matter how big it is. It's just a miracle that we're able to do this. So, yeah.
Peter asks, which boulevards or parkways besides Hillside Parkway and Willamette Boulevard from the 1904 plan were built and still exist today?
I think he just named them. No, it was a concept for carriages. Cars came along and changed the whole thing, absolutely changed it. We didn't need these lovely leisurely drives between parks. We needed major roadways that not only went around the city and were good for cars, but took us off to other cities. The neighborhood connects us with the whole state. So the loveliness of, say, Boston's Emerald Necklace Parks and all its gorgeous boulevards never came to be in Portland. It was just a beautiful concept of linear parks, that connected with big parks, and Portland never enjoyed that. Seattle did to a much bigger extent, because when it put the roadways down around all the lakes with lovely public access to the lakes, there's a permanent improvement and a great improvement. It's one of the main features of Seattle, and they have a fantastic park system. Yeah. Oh my gosh, is someone's actually asking a question on that little machine?
Yeah, absolutely. There's another one.
Oh my gosh.
Susanna asks, did Mish have family?
Yes, he
Can you
did.
repeat the question?
Did Mish have a family? All I know is that he had one, and they lived in the caretaker's cottage at what is now Washington Park, now long gone. I don't know anything more about his family. If they were still around, I'd love to talk to them. His father went through a difficult period when they changed the form of government in the city. The commissioners wanted to have much more control, and they did not see they had a genius in their midst that they should appreciate. So they started pushing him around. It became awkward, and he moved on. Gosh, I'm glad there's someone out there.
Okay, here's another
Come
one.
on.
Gil asks, in your opinion, of the original 18 park principles, how many are still being practiced?
Oh.
Which ones should be adhered to? For instance, number 16.
Oh my God, no, that's quite a question. Number 16. Let's see, what's 16? I am not an expert on these 18 principles, but that's number 16 has to do with, I can find it.
It says that parks should be governed by qualified officials.
Oh, parks should be governed by qualified. Oh, I totally agree. Gosh. Now, if there ever was a truism in the history of the world, is that parks should be governed by qualified park people. That's a good question, whoever you are out there. It's an omen too. Listen to the rules. Was there another question?
I think that's it.
Oh, that's it.
There's some very nice comments which I'll share.
Oh, well, I hope they all enjoyed it.
Yeah, so thanks.
Well, I think you are all very special here. You pulled this together. See, you're so genius. Last 45 minutes before it opened. Magic, it worked. Oh, thank you all very much. I like live audiences. Pardon? Pardon? Oh, yeah, oh, absolutely. Here.
Good evening, everyone, and I just want to say thank you one more time to Bill for his wonderful presentation. The gift of a deeper understanding of our sense of place in Portland is just something that helps connect us to the place that we live and the places that make this city our home. So thank you so much, Bill. As we were going through the slides, I'm sure many of us felt, as I did, that we were going through a scrapbook of some of my dearest friends, looking at all of these Portland parks. So Friends of Columbia Park is a 501c3 volunteer organization dedicated to stewardship of the Jewel of the North. So if you like beautiful parks, big trees, pickleball, civic education, native plants, the satisfaction of a Saturday morning trash pickup with your closest friends and neighbors, well, you might like us, and we would probably like you. So please check us out at Friends of Columbia Park, www.focp.com. We are always looking for new members to help us carry out our mission. If you like the work that we do, we're always accepting donations as well. It helps us take our work further and do more projects like this. So thank you everyone so much again for tuning in. For the folks in the room, we have a little surprise afterwards, but for everybody joining us online, we would just like to say thank you once again for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful night.